So one of the subtexts of the last 30 years was not only U.S. hegemony, but also make sure that there isn't a close German-Russian relationship. And that's, of course, the essence of the U.S. opposition to Nord Stream and to natural economic trade between Europe and Russia. And the United States broke it. And the Europeans basically worked for the United States during that period against the interests of Europe. Now they're recognizing, my God, what are we supposed to, I mean, they're not quite recognizing, they're shell-shocked. They're completely bewildered of what's happening. What's happening is very sensible, which is we're pulling back from the brink of World War III. This is great news. There's no question about it that it's great news. And as you say, they can't even figure out that it's good news. And Europe is one of the huge, complete puzzles in all of this. Europe is, it's 450 million people. It's got an economy in purchasing power terms of about $30 trillion. This is a big, important place without a foreign policy. It's rather amazing. Now, yesterday, interestingly, in the parliament, I can't speak for more than those that I met, and it was a peace group that hosted the meeting, but there were many members of many of the political groups at this talk that I gave. Something will change even in Europe. Of course, they're completely bewildered because van der Leyen and Kallas and everybody else in the European leadership staked everything on a militarist, confrontational, U.S.-led, Biden-esque, deep state U.S. approach, and it's gone suddenly. And so they're all out there without any scaffolding, without any sense, without any direction. They don't know what they're doing, but they are realizing something different needs to be done. This is the tragedy. Germany and Russia are absolutely complementary economies. Russia, with its combination of technology and incredible engineering sophistication and vast natural resources, and Germany with its industrial base, fit together economically. It's an incredible combination. The United States hated that idea, the deep state. I go back on this issue 35 years. At the request of President Gorbachev's economic team, I tried to bring the U.S. and the Soviet Union together in 1990, 1991. My idea was that the United States at that time would help with financial stabilization, provide some grants and loans so that the Soviet Union could carry out its political and industrial and economic reforms. It was the idea that I had was rejected completely by the White House, and I didn't understand that that was the neocon moment taking hold. Recently, it was fascinating for me. I read the minutes of the National Security Council meeting dissing my idea, and I never read them before. It was somebody sent them from the archives. They've just been opened up, and the Americans were completely stupid and obnoxious. One of them was a former colleague of mine at Harvard, completely obnoxious. What they say in the meeting is, we have to do the minimum. We're not going to help on anything. We're no vision, just U.S. nastiness. Well, I experienced it, but I hadn't read the minutes of the actual meeting when when this approach was decided. In the 1990s, basically the American view was, Russia's nothing except we can grab the natural resources. I hated it. Of course, I tried to help with President Yeltsin raise funding again, turned down flat because the Americans had a completely different idea, which was unipolarity and grab natural resources where you can. I also found it extremely important. Now, it's tantalizing. It doesn't prove anything, but it's a glimmer of hope. Here, the two are meeting in Riyadh. Now, Saudi Arabia is absolutely the linchpin of achieving peace in the Middle East. And there they are at the invitation of the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. And I believe, I'm guessing, that they spoke about Israel and Palestine. Just as peace will come to Ukraine now, peace could come to the Middle East, basically with the one change of vote by the United States, a vote for a Palestinian state as the 194th member of the UN. And then there will be normalization of relations with Israel by Saudi Arabia, by actually all 57 countries of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. We're tantalizingly close to a breakthrough for peace. Again, whether Donald Trump can break the iron grip of the Israel lobby in the United States, which has done so much profound damage to American politics and to the Middle East and to world peace and risks, I don't know. But he's broken the iron grip of the deep state neocon project, and maybe he can break the iron grip of the Israel lobby the same way. Well, the war is, of course, a war between the U.S. and Russia being fought on Ukrainian territory. It's not a war between Ukraine and Russia. This is the basic point. This goes back for 30 years in the Ukraine project of expanding the U.S. military reach eastward, basically, by the way, from Brussels to Vladivostok was the ultimate aim. In other words, this is U.S. hegemony at play, and President Putin said no. And the war broke out 11 years ago at the Maidan coup, which was also a U.S. action to a very substantial extent to overthrow a Ukrainian government that favored neutrality, and the Ukrainian public favored neutrality overwhelmingly. There was no move by the Ukrainian people to join NATO. This was a top-down push and coup in February. Russia is a very sophisticated economy filled with very sophisticated people and well-trained engineers. And by the way, as the world's largest land area with vast natural resources, the population is modest by big power standards at 150 million people, but we're entering an age where the number of people is not really decisive. There are going to be humanoid robots and AI systems and many other things. This incredible land area, the vast resources, the northern route, the Arctic route, something that is obviously on President Trump's mind, means that Russia is a great power, no question, for generations to come, and one that will play in increasing significance in the world economy. And this is partly what was discussed in Riyadh. So in this sense, the war started by the United States eastward movement and every other U.S. action, especially, by the way, and it's very much underestimated in its impact, the 2002 unilateral abandonment of the anti-ballistic missile treaty by the United States was, to my view, the most profound destabilizer of all, because ultimately we're talking about survival, nation state survival, national security, missile systems. This is what has been on President Putin's mind for 20 years. Keep your missile systems away from our border. This has been enunciated repeatedly. As Ray McGovern, the former CIA wonderful analyst, told us a few months ago, in February 2014, the United States participated actively in a violent coup to overthrow Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, who favored neutrality. This is very important to understand. The coup took place on February 22nd, 2014. Again, I saw some of this with my own eyes. It was ugly, the U.S. involvement in this coup. U.S. forces paid for this coup to an important extent. They stirred up this coup.
This is all well understood. The American role in this has been quite sordid for a very, very long time. The goal, starting back in 1994, was to expand NATO and surround Russia in the Black Sea region. President Clinton signed off on that in 1994. Zbig Brzezinski wrote about it in the Grand Chessboard in 1997, explaining it, and explaining in a chapter that is completely wrong when you look back at it, said Russia will not be able to resist any of this. In 2002, the U.S. destabilized the relationship by unilaterally abandoning the anti-ballistic missile treaty. In 2008, the United States invited Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO, basically over strong objections by the Europeans, but the Europeans went along in the NATO Bucharest summit in 2008 over Russia's brightest red lines. This was all known, understood provocations. All of the diplomats knew it. European leaders knew it. I spoke with them at the time. Everybody understood this. Now, in 2015, the war could have ended with the Minsk II agreements, but the United States and Ukraine, despite the UN Security Council backing, said, no, you don't have to do that. That was not a territorial claim on the Donbass by Russia. It was a claim for autonomy that the UN Security Council unanimously supported, and the U.S. and the governments in Ukraine, at the U.S. behest to an important extent, completely dissed. Biden knew what he was doing. It was a terrible mistake of the Democrats, let me say, and of President Biden and his team. And then it's true that Biden and Putin met in 2021. In December 2021, President Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement. It was a completely negotiable document. I spent quite a bit of time speaking with the White House about that document. There should have been negotiations. The U.S. rejected negotiation over the central point, which was non-NATO enlargement to Ukraine. Then in March 2022, just days after the start of Russia's invasion, but by the way, the war had been going on for years, but this escalation in starting February 22nd, 2022, just days after that, they went to the negotiating table. And they came very close to an agreement until the U.S. and Britain stopped it. Boris Johnson, one of the most irresponsible politicians in our modern time, explained it explicitly later. He said this is a war about preserving Western hegemony. Yes, this was a proxy war against Russia. This was the plan all along. And the U.S. and U.K. told Zelensky, basically, leave.
So the idea that China is an aggressive power, there's nothing in the Chinese statecraft, history, or tradition of this. Even when China was undoubtedly the regional hegemon in terms of power, it did not impose punitive actions. It did not invade. It did not try to expand its territories. This is all very important to understand, because when Wang Yi speaks about statecraft, he's speaking about a very deep vision of statecraft. When the West speaks about statecraft and the Westphalian order and so forth, they're speaking either with knowledge or implicitly, with their implicit knowledge or their background culture, that states fight each other. And in the international relations of the West, the realism idea is, well, it's just a tragedy. We're doomed to fight. The Chinese actually do not hold that view. And I mean, not just superficially, not propagandistically, actually, They do not hold that view. They do not quite understand, why are you always fighting? Stop. We can get along. We can trade. We can do other things. And this is absolutely basically true. China does not threaten the United States in any way. It happens to be extremely successful, very dynamic, technologically sophisticated. Wonderful. It's bringing all sorts of great things to the world, like DeepSeek, low-cost AI, and many, many other things. There's no possibility that the two sides could damage each other except to blow up the world. And so stop provoking. This is the number one point. Number two is Chinese statecraft. It's incredibly mature, in my opinion, and in my experience. And I go back in China 43 years, and I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of visits, but it's a lot, many times every year. Chinese statecraft is extraordinarily impressive because you do feel the lessons and awareness of 2,200 years of history of statecraft. The U.S. is a baby compared to this, trying to find its footing. China was unified first in 221 BC. Now, there's a phenomenal period to understand and study between 1368, the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, and 18, which was when Britain invaded. So 1839, when Britain invaded. During that period of several centuries, East Asia was dominated by a very successful China, but not tormented by China. It was an era of peace. Unbelievable. Europe's fighting. Everybody's fighting each other, killing each other, nonstop wars. East Asia is in peace, sometimes called the Confucian peace. But the point is, the Chinese, when they were running the show, not the Yuan Mongol dynasty, but the Ming and the Qing, never invaded Japan, never invaded Korea, right there, right on the border, never. With Vietnam, there was a war, 1410 to 1427, basically 17 years out of 6 centuries. Whereas think about France and Britain, for example, nonstop, 100 years wars, nonstop conflict. So you had nation states, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, China. They're not fighting each other for centuries. China never, ever in its history invaded Japan, ever. The Mongols did when they controlled China twice in 1274 and 1281 AD. They tried, and they were defeated by the so-called kamikaze winds, 2 typhoons. I've always believed, I've said for years and years and years and years, and the years are now quite long, that there are no fundamental conflicts between the United States and Russia. I'll say the same, that there are no fundamental conflicts between the United States and China. It seems that President Trump is pursuing that approach, which would mark a dramatic change of American foreign policy, a fundamental change, I would say, that is a break with the last 33 years. 33 years. Why? Because when the Soviet Union ended in December 1991, the neocons, the believers in the United States, in the unipolar world that America and its unique military, financial, economic, technological power in their minds meant that the United States ran the world. We should always be cautious and careful when we're analyzing these events. But I have to say, I hope I'm not just getting swept up in it. It seems pretty momentous, what's happening right now. It seems more than the news cycle or the spin cycle. What has happened in the last few days is President Trump has respectfully spoken with President Putin and said the United States does not aim to run the world or to damage Russia's security. the United States government has acknowledged that NATO will not expand to Ukraine and to Georgia, which was part of a 30-year game played by the United States, very dangerous and violent game. And more than that, it was not only picking up the phone or having a discussion or having a meeting in Riyadh, but actually a rather impressive, it seems, move to normal relations, a restoration of economic relations, as you said, a new chapter, we hope and pray, for a stability of the nuclear arms framework. President Trump made remarkable statements, brief statements, but remarkable statements about three-way negotiations of Russia, China, and the United States to reduce nuclear arms, to avoid an extraordinarily dangerous and costly, quote, modernization of nuclear arsenal. There was another extraordinary statement by President Putin's spokesperson, Mr. Peskov, who said, our concern is not about Ukraine joining the European Union. Our concern is about military, security, NATO. This is quite different. Extraordinary, such a statement. So clear, of course, extraordinary in the context that it's so rational. I've always believed that. I've always said that Europe's greatest mistake was to co-locate NATO and the European Union in the same city. Almost an accident, by the way, when NATO headquarters left Paris. Shouldn't have gone to Brussels, but increasingly NATO and the EU became the same thing, to Europe's devastating consequence, because Europe lost its foreign policy, lost its autonomy, lost its sense, lost its voice, doesn't understand what's going on. And when you ask me, I'm here in Brussels, I was at the European Parliament yesterday. There is so much confusion in Europe because it's been years and years and years in which Europe simply gave away its foreign policy. So they don't have diplomacy. They don't know how to have diplomacy because they're so rusty at it. I've been saying to European leaders for years, go to Moscow, talk. You're on the same continent. You're neighbors. What are you doing? But they don't. They warmonger. And then yesterday, our Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, called for deep, and according to the headline numbers, truly deep cuts in the U.S. military. This has not happened for decades. And immediately our congressmen and senators jumped up and down because they're on the payrolls of, or they're funded in their campaigns, or their families are funded by the military industrial complex in the United States. So these are all extraordinary statements. Now, I don't know whether the Trump administration is going to follow that particular logic. Donald Trump loves oil and gas under the ground. This is not where our future lies in the 21st century, actually, but he loves it. It's not the basis of U.S. Well-being, U.S. prosperity. Now, there is, to put it a different way, no shortcut to economic well-being in a knowledge economy except knowledge, technology, systems, thinking carefully, basing decision-making on evidence, on science, and so forth. China is extremely good at that. Made in China 2025, which was an initiative launched a decade ago to come to the forefront of several technologies, succeeded because it was systematic, because it had a decade-long, if not 20 or 30-year-long forward vision. For the United States to succeed, it should do what it absolutely can do. We have wonderful universities, wonderful research centers, wonderful enterprises that are investing heavily in research and development, building the economy. It has nothing to do with war with Russia, war with China, fights over natural resources. It's knowledge, capacity, organization, science and technology. This is what we're really talking about right now. I think there are also a couple of basic points that are really important. For many centuries, many recent centuries, certainly the 20th century, the idea that control over natural resources was the decisive element of economic wealth, the military power, national greatness was taken for granted. And in the petroleum age, especially after Churchill put the British fleet on oil, this was the view. You have to control the Middle East. You have to control the natural resources. We're living in an age, of course, it may sound trite to say, but it's true. We're living in an age where it is technology, it is advanced technology, it is digital technologies, it is a knowledge-based economy that's the source of wealth, the source of well-being. And you don't need that physical control over natural resources in the same way at all. Incidentally, the protectionism that the Trump administration is putting in is also beside the point. It's a little sad. It's not getting to the point. If Trump will play to America's strengths, which is its deep educational excellence, its technological excellence, its human diversity, which is wonderful because I live in New York City. I hear English once in a while, and I love the fact that 200 languages are spoken. It makes it a great city that reaches the entire world and becomes a media, financial, and technology diplomatic capital. This is the strengths. I think Trump gets a lot of this absolutely right. War is useless. This isn't about war. This is not about conflict and so forth. He gets that right. And if he can play to America's true strengths, this is going to be a golden age, exactly what he wants it to be. If he plays to, the short-term gimmicks, the thinking grab resources or somehow protectionism or something else, it will not quite work the same way. There's so many interesting things to say about Chinese statecraft and about U.S.-China relations. One place to start is that President Trump said yesterday or the day before, this Ukraine war, it's not about, we shouldn't be doing this. We have this big, beautiful ocean between us and the Russians. We're not in conflict with each other. Well, the Pacific Ocean is a lot bigger. China is not in a million years going to invade the United States, and the U.S. can't invade and defeat China. It's very simple. The two, if we're misguided, could provoke each other. The United States could do in East Asia what it did in Ukraine. The obvious analogy is Taiwan. If the United States continues to provoke to unilaterally arm Taiwan, this could trigger war. The war would be devastating for the world, but devastating for the United States, as every war game has shown. And as makes sense, you fight a war against China, thousands of miles away from your shores. You think that's going to work in this day and age with new technologies, with the hypersonic missile systems attacking your naval fleets, with the continual space surveillance of the oceans and so on? Come on, this is so ridiculous. Even the idea is absurd. Now, that's one point.